Tier 1 programs. And what do we mean by that? I mean the very, very select few, and I'll list them in just a second. It won't take more than one breath to do. But as you saw and as we discussed Thursday night, JT Daniels transfers from USC to Georgia. And that was unexpected. I don't know if it was necessarily the biggest shockwave that's ever been sent through college football, but it was a little bit unexpected. And so as I detailed Thursday night, if you missed it, then you can watch the replay or you could watch the individual video. They can both be found on the Late Kick with Josh Pate playlist on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. There were about 90% of Georgia Bulldog fans that had the same reaction I did. Well, that's great. Let's stack as many good options as we can on the roster. That's how the elite programs in college football do it, and then we'll just let competition sort it out. And then there was the vast minority, but vocal minority. Funny how that works. And the vocal minority said a whole lot of things I disagreed with. So basically, what I wanted to do with tonight's show to lead it off is I wanted to talk about how a Tier 1 program is wired, how the elite of the elite are wired, and why they are elite. It's no mistake that the same programs just seem to win every year, and they seem to land the top recruiting classes every year. And you would look around and you would think, well, if we applied professional sports logic to college sports, then just the big market teams should be good, right? That's not the way it works in college because different dynamics are in place in college. So briefly, let's talk about it. You can disagree or agree with me here. Tier 1 programs, I mean the best of the best, pretty much all factors taken into the equation here. I've got Alabama, LSU, and Georgia from the SEC. Those are the Tier 1 programs to me in the Southeastern Conference. I think there's one of them in the Big Ten right now, and that's clearly Ohio State. And I think there's one of them in the ACC, and that's obviously Clemson. You could argue Oklahoma here. I did not put Oklahoma in it. You could argue Oregon could approach this status in the near future, which they could. I agree with you on both counts. I didn't put them in here. Notice I'm not telling you that the only programs that exhibit the characteristics that it takes to be elite were included on this list. I'm telling you these are Tier 1 programs, and then there may be some others out there on the periphery or on their way up that are also doing it the right way. They're just not there quite yet. So here's what happened. What happened was JT Daniels makes his announcement, and then he's headed to Georgia. And the minority, albeit very small minority, but the vocal minority of Georgia Bulldog fans that I was talking about on the Thursday show, they brought up points like this. What if this upsets the quarterback room chemistry? What if it upsets the psyche of quarterbacks already on the roster? What does this say to Jamie Newman? We brought him in from Wake Forest, and now all of a sudden we bring in another transfer quarterback. Maybe he'll be eligible this year, maybe not. But what does it say to Carson Beck, Brock Vandergriff, guys that we have already on the roster or committed? What about guys who have waited their turn? This is kind of something you hear outside of quarterback. Just, if you get a transfer safety in and you got guys that have waited their turn, what about these guys who have waited their turn? Here's what I want to tell you about Tier 1 programs. And the first thing I want to tell you is the inside of a program, the mentality there doesn't always necessarily reflect that of every one of its fans. So if you're a fan sitting on the sidewalk saying these things, it doesn't mean Kirby Smart's saying the same thing in the Butts Mare Athletic Complex in Athens, Georgia. They don't have these conversations in Columbus, Ohio, or Tuscaloosa, or Baton Rouge, or Athens, Clemson, anywhere where I mentioned Tier 1s and beyond. As I said, this is not just exclusive to a few programs, but the thing about it is, as long as you look around the landscape of college football, and as long as there are Tier 1 programs, you are never going to be where they are if you think like the, albeit vast minority that I just mentioned, think. You can't worry about feelings. I know this is kind of popular when you try and make yourself sound intellectually superior to a room. I don't care about feelings. I'm above feelings. Well, sometimes you guys are full of it. But other times, as is the case right here, you better have taken that into account, and that better be how you're running your program. Now, here's how the Tier 1 programs run, and here's why they are where they are. Everyone's clear on message, everyone's clear on goals, everyone's doing their job, and everything you need is provided. We're looking at Ed Orgeron right now, if you're watching on the YouTube channel. Ed Orgeron just won a national championship, so he's a good example to look at right here. Ed Orgeron did everything the way he should have done it last year, but he could do the same job, put forth the same effort, and end up 9-3 if he wasn't given an adequate recruiting budget, if they weren't given the facilities they need to compete with the other tier ones in order to get folks in the door, if they didn't have an army of support staff and analysts, the likes of which it takes to properly match the army they have at Alabama or the army they have at Ohio State. The point is, it extends beyond just the effort the guys you have in the room are putting in. You've also got to have top-down buy-in from your administration, from your donor class, from your president, from your athletic director. Everyone's got to be all in. And at the tier one places, the ones I just mentioned, there is no questioning of, are you pulling this way when he's pulling this way, when she's pulling that way? Everyone's pulling the same direction. You can't afford not to. Because if you're split on what the goal is and what the purpose is and who's doing what job, you end up like Texas has been for a little while. You end up like Alabama was in the pre-Saban era. All the tradition in the world, all the resources at your disposal, and yet you can't get out of your own way. It's not that hard to spot the athletic departments across the country where people aren't all pulling in the same direction. So then we look around and we see the recruiting landscape. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. When you talk about how you got to keep recruiting the best, and you can't worry about who's on your roster right now, you got to keep trying to recruit over them. Well, that's exactly what the recruiting process is. For a tier one program, for the best, Ryan Day, we're looking at him right now, Kirby Smart, Nick Saban, Orgeron, Dabo Swinney, the way that those guys do it is they recruit you and they're pretty straightforward with you. And I know a lot of you guys believe that the way that they land these top 5 classes after top 5 classes is they just go out and they promise playing time and their illegal benefits and all this stuff. That's not the real world. It's just not the way it works. I've explained this to you a couple of weeks ago. What happens with most of these programs is they go out and they want to use the recruiting process as a filtration process. Here's what I mean by that. If you know, as we said before, if you know that there are other programs out there wired like this, where they make everything ultra difficult and ultra competitive, that by default is how you have to be wired, or you're not going to be able to match them. How do you do that in recruiting? Well, the way you do it in recruiting is you walk into a kid's living room and you tell them, we want you, we don't need you, we're going to win with or without you. We would love for you to be a part of this program, but there are no guarantees of playing time, first off. And secondly, there is no guarantee of, once we land you, well, that's pretty much it at your position for the next couple of years because we got you, so we know we're good. They're trying to recruit over you the moment you sign. They want to land someone better the moment you sign. And they're honest with you about it if they're running things the right way. And here's what it's meant to do. What it's meant to do is it's meant to challenge you mentally. Because if you're turned off by that ideology, if you're turned off by the notion of them trying to recruit athletes the caliber of you or even better than you, then you're not the kind of player that is wired mentally to compete at and get a starting job at a tier one program. Their whole philosophy is they'd much rather find that out about you when you're a senior in high school than 2 years into your college career when it turns out you were not mentally tough enough to make it there, but you're taking up a roster spot. So in summary, that's the way that they operate at tier one programs, and that's the way you got to operate if you're ever going to match them. And now you ask yourself maybe, well, what does Oklahoma have to do? Because Oklahoma's a team that's been in the playoff conversation, been in the playoffs, but they can't seem to get over that hump. The Oklahoma problem, if you want to call it that, I don't think is any kind of an ideological problem. I just think that it's maybe a little bit harder to get a defensive roster in place just like that matches what you got to defend against, for example, LSU. Alex Grinch came in there, had a grand total of, less than a year and really no time to put his defensive roster together. And last year's Peach Bowl was what it was. I'm not saying it only takes what I just talked about. I'm saying that's the starting point. That's kind of the foundation that you have to have built in order to ever start climbing towards, where these other programs hang out. Think about how close it is, even if you've got it all in line. Think about Ohio State and Ryan Day. They get out to the Fiesta Bowl last year and get a pretty sizable lead on Clemson, and yet still couldn't put them away. You're doing all the stuff right. You're doing everything right, and it's still margins. It's just fractions of an inch here and there. You could beat Purdue by 1,000,000 points. You could beat Iowa by 1,000,000 points, just like Clemson could beat Wake Forest by 1,000,000 points. None of that really matters in the grand scheme of things because that's not what we're talking about with them. a lot of people look at maybe Clemson's recruiting efforts and they say, when is enough enough? You know, you're already beating everybody by a country mile in the ACC. That's not what they're recruiting for. They're recruiting to beat Bama and Georgia and LSU and Oklahoma. That's the kind of program they have to beat. That's why when we're looking at Ohio State right now, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter how wide the gap is between them and the Big Ten, because there is no gap between Ohio State and the 3 or 4 other programs that I just mentioned in Tier 1. You might as well put them in their own conference. Because when the conversation about Tier 1s and college football playoff and all that, when that starts, those are the programs that are there.